cannot believe he repeated that awesome comment. I just was saying, taking the piss out of myself, and then he repeats it here. Unbelievable. Thanks for the introduction, David. That's amazing. I've never heard anybody talk about me in such positive terms. Look, and I also want to thank Annette for organising tonight, because it's a pretty remarkable event. I didn't even know it happened down here, and then when I looked online, I realised how many people come and what it means to the town. I was like, my God, I can't believe I've been invited. So especially after Les Murray, who's a freaking legend, and was an honour to listen to. So the reason I've been invited here, and I might have to read because I'm a really pretty crappy public speaker. So the reason I've been invited here is because in 2016 I wrote a book called Farewell to the Father. And that was basically about my life growing up as the son of a highly successful, charismatic, warm, loving maniac, really. It's also how that childhood affected me and my siblings and shaped our later lives. In Angela's Ashes, the author Frank McCourt says, "When I look back on my childhood, I wonder how I survived it all. It was, of course, a miserable childhood. The happy childhood is hardly worth your while." And my childhood was not miserable at all. I had a very privileged upbringing. I grew up in a big, beautiful house in a place called Mossman Bay, which would have to be one of the most beautiful parts of Australia, apart from Albury, of course. We had a pool. I went to a lovely school, had a loving stay-at-home mum and 3 fantastic siblings. I used to spend the majority of my life either fishing down in the bay or surfing in the nearby beaches. It was all fantastic, and I was very lucky. But hanging over all of that was this, the spectre sort of looming over all of us of my father. And Dad was an amazing character. He was, especially if you're a writer, he was a huge, colourful, powerful personality. He was a doctor, a really good doctor. He worked at Royal North Shore Hospital for about 15 years, and he was a wallaby, played rugby for Australia in the 50s, and he toured everywhere. He toured South Africa and New Zealand and Japan. To me, growing up, he was an absolute god. I mean, I worshipped the guy. He was strong, he was over 6 foot tall, and he was built like a mountain range, and he was smart. He saved people's lives, and he saved hundreds of people's lives over the years as his work as a doctor. He loved reading and classical music. He loved the sun and the sand, and he could body surf like a sea lion, a very big sea lion. I loved the way he looked, his bashed up face, and he had a broken nose, and at one stage he had an eyelid torn off playing rugby, and he had a bit through his tongue, and so he had this amazingly brutalised kind of face that I loved. And he had this, we'd go to the beach and we'd come back and he'd be all tanned, and he'd have these massive white teeth and this head of bushy hair that became like steel wire, like a bird's nest after it had been in the sun and the wind. And I loved his he used to give us probably everybody who relate Chinese burns and squeezy kneesies. He was a really tactile guy, and he loved to hug us and give us aeroplanes, and he loved us. But he also was what back then would have been called manic depressive, and he was prone to these crazy mood swings. So when he wasn't attempting suicide, he was dancing and singing and taking his clothes off and running around everywhere around the house and the streets naked. If he wasn't chasing Mum around the dinner table with a carving knife, he was flying us all to Europe to look at the Mona Lisa in the Louvre. He was mad. And as a kid, though, the most affecting part was his many suicide attempts. And the first I remember was when I was a child of 7, and I came downstairs, and he was sitting at the kitchen table, and I so remember he was wearing a red dressing gown we'd given him, and he had the red moccasins on that we had given him for his birthday the year before, and he was propped against the door still, and fuming at the mouth and frothing in the mouth, and in a state pretty close to comatose. And at the time, as a 7-year-old, my mother had called me down because she genuinely thought it was that he wasn't going to make it through the night, and she thought hard to second guess, but I guess she thought that it was the last time I might get a chance to see him, so she'd called me down. So I walked down, and he's sitting there, and I remember it was probably the greatest fear I've ever had in my life, looking at this guy, thinking that he was going to die imminently. And I've never felt a fear like it when someone you think is someone you love possibly the most appears to be on the brink of death. And it was inexpressible, the fear I felt at that time. Thing is that it didn't happen. He didn't die. And he went on to reenact this kind of scenario over many, many years. And the thing is that a week later, after that kind of an episode, he would be running around pulling some ridiculous freaking stunt, like we would go to a restaurant and he would pay, and he'd get up to go and leave the restaurant, and then he'd clutch his chest and go, "Oh God," and then sort of fall on the floor and pull his chairs down, and everybody would get up and go, "Fuck, and what's going on?" And then he'd pop up and go, "Ha ha," and he'd think that was the funniest joke in the world. That was hilarious to him. And living with Dad then was interesting and challenging. Mental illness these days has been largely, but obviously not entirely destigmatised. But it wasn't like that at all. We are a long way back, of course, in the 70s and 80s. I mean, Dad's depression was something that back then we would never have talked about to anybody. I mean, I would never have mentioned it to my friends at school. None of my siblings would have talked about it to any of their friends. And certainly my mother, I know for a fact, only ever mentioned it to her sister, which was quite amazing. Looking back, the only person she trusted with it was her nearest sibling. So really back then it was all about dissembling, lying, we were trying to disguise the fact of what was going on in our house, and that exacted quite a toll on everybody, especially when Dad got increasingly violent. What happened then was that because I was the youngest kid and my oldest siblings all left home, there was my 2 sisters and my brother, and they all left home. So it really left me and Mum in the house by ourselves with this maniac man. So it was interesting because then it became just us 3, and Dad's behaviour became worse and worse and more out of control. And it all kind of culminated when I was in my last year of school, when I was 17, would have been 17, and Dad walked into my room when I was studying one night, and he said, "Okay, so I want you to roll me a joint." And Dad, I've got to explain that Dad and Mum were very permissive. They'd let us grow dope in the backyard. They'd let us have our boyfriends and girlfriends sleep over. So he said to me, I want you to roll me a joint so that I know why you kids do it. You know, what's the big deal? I want to try this." So Dad being Dad, you don't say no. So I rolled him a joint. He smoked this joint. About half an hour later, all shit broke loose. I heard Mum screaming at the top of her lungs from downstairs. So I fly out of my bedroom, down the stairs, I find Mum bailed up by Dad in the corner of where the stairs met the front door, and he was coming at her. So I launched across the room and got between Mum and Dad, at which point Dad leant out and grabbed my neck and started strangling me, at which point Mum started clobbering Dad over the head. Dad dropped me, and then Mum and me just took off out the door and up the front steps to the street above. And it was the most bizarre thing. I can remember it like it was literally like it was yesterday, how slow everything went. I remember it was the most... We were running fast. I know, objectively, I know we were running as fast as we could run. But looking back now, even today, 30 years later, it seems literally like we were in slow motion, like we were only just moving. And even when we passed up the garden halfway and Dad picked up a pitchfork out of the garden and came after us. And I remember getting to the top of the street, and to my surprise, there was my sister sitting in her car with the engine idling on the street. And as I later found out, my mum had called my sister, Camilla, and said, look, stuff could get a bit crazy tonight. I've got a bad feeling. Just come and sit in the street above with your car, and if all goes south, you'll be there for us. So we get to the top of the street. Thank God she's there with the car, the engine idling. We hop in the car, screech off down the road. And the last thing I remember is looking out the back window and looking at Dad with this pitchfork and his eyes rolling around in his head in just complete pure fury and confusion. And from that stage on, things just got really, really crazy. Mum and I had to rent an apartment around the corner. And we couldn't tell Dad where the place was for obvious reasons. But at the same time, Dad was all by himself in the house. So someone, my siblings and I, we all had to kind of regularly drop around and make sure that he was still alive, that he could survive, because he was a complete domestic cripple. This guy couldn't so much as boil an egg. So we used to go around there and take meals and make sure he was okay. In this day and age, this sounds completely ridiculous, or maybe it doesn't. Maybe all you guys out there have an example of this where there are members of your family who you, for one reason or another, have had to, for want of a better word, abandon because it's all too scary or too difficult or too complex. But what happened was that we used to visit Dad, and he got in the habit of writing letters in longhand over the next 5 months. And he wrote in longhand 100,000 words to Mum, letters all to Mum, begging Mum to come back, begging her to be with him again, because he loved her. He absolutely adored her, and she was the only woman for him. What happened was I used to have to go around like a go-between, take the letters from Dad, make sure he's okay, cook him a meal kind of thing, take the letter, take it back to Mum. Mum would read it in the apartment, burst into tears. The cycle would repeat. I'd go back to Dad, pick up a letter, take it back to Mum, all that sort of stuff. Now, over a 5-month period, he said increasingly, if you don't come back to me, it's the end of me, I will never survive. And Mum had promised herself that as she left that house after 30 years, I think 40 years of marriage, she said, if I finally leave this house, I will only leave it once, I will never come back. She'd made that promise to herself and to us. And so when she'd left that house, she was not coming back no matter what Dad wrote. And in the end, of course, she didn't come back. And as you can probably guess, Dad ended up killing himself. So in a funny way, that was for us a massive relief, and the worst thing that had ever happened to all of us. So it was this mix of fury and grief and hatred and love that all got bound up in this very powerful tornado, sort of emotional tornado that ripped through our lives for the next 20 years and has shaped me and my family forever. And it wasn't good. But the remarkable thing is that the really interesting thing I find about the whole episode, I mean, that story I just told you would have, again, all of you guys out here, you wouldn't be here unless you related in some way to that kind of a story. But the really interesting thing, I was thinking on the way in the plane down here, I was thinking, so what's different about my story from any of the story you guys might have? And I realised, and I have to read kind of this because I'm not great with... The really interesting thing was that after all, I wrote a book about this, right? So, but after all the dust had settled from writing this book, and I'd done all the sort of the writers' festivals, the talks, all that sort of stuff, I got back to working at the magazine, a Good Weekend, where you write features, and it's like journalism. It is meant to be journalism. And at one point, there was a story that I'd been working on for a while, and it was kind of really important to me, and I'd invested a lot of myself in this story. And it got published, and after it was published, I realised that I'd made a mistake in this story. And it was only one word that I'd got wrong. And it wasn't, but it was quite a bad mistake. But it wasn't the end of the world. But what happened was that for some reason, this one mistake got in my head, and I could not get it out of my head, and it grew like this horrible sort of snowballing ogre of a thing in my head. Couldn't get it out, and it got worse and worse and worse until the only thing in my head was this huge, massive screw-up that I'd made. And then, for want of a better word, I basically had a nervous breakdown, which sounds absolutely ridiculous, over this one mistake. And so I ended up being admitted to a facility in Sydney, and I remember on the day that I was taken there, I rocked up to the front door of this place, and I realised, looking at it, that it was the same place that we had taken Dad to 30 years before. And so I just looked at this and I thought, how the freaking hell did my life get to this stage? But I also looked at the doors thinking, given what happened to Dad, I didn't have a lot of confidence in this place I was about to get into. But the good thing is that I did, you get out, I got out, I'm here, I'm alive, I'm very grateful to be here. I am, as opposed to Dad, I'm still alive. And that's a message that's worth repeating to people who think that life is all fucked and it's not worth being alive. It is worth being alive. The experience of life is trauma and pain, obviously. It's very difficult, it's full of troubles. But essentially, being alive is a great thing. And feeling the skin, the air on your skin and the wind in your lungs, as Nick Cave said, is a great thing. And that's all we've got. And you've got to persevere, because life is worth living. And so thanks for listening.